We've all been there. A speeding ticket. And not just any speeding ticket. A speeding ticket while on a trip abroad. And that comes with all kinds of problems, like late penalties and foreign language barriers, or government websites that only accept obscure ways of payment. It's time for a revolution. With PayTicket, your foreign parking ticket problems are a thing of the past. Simply input your information, such as name, email, and country of residence. Take a quick photo of your ticket, plug in your credit card details, and click Send. And PayTicket will take care of the rest. No matter what kind of traffic or parking violation you may have to pay, PayTicket makes it easier. Simple, fast, hassle-free. That's PayTicket.
Hi, Tara. No. This is true.
Stunning video templates. Each video maker is carefully designed to look professional. Our video makers are super easy to use and let anyone with an internet connection create high quality videos in seconds. Edit logos, mockups, videos, and design templates with just a few clicks. Each template is carefully made by design experts, so your work will always look great. Get started with the best video maker at Plazy.net.
She placed the mug on the counter. It rattled against the Formica. I immediately wished I'd kept quiet. Is that why you came here? No, of course not. I only found out yesterday. You like writing about missing children, don't you? Are you researching a sequel? Are you going to write about how my daughter was eaten by a fucking monster? She glared at me, then abruptly left the room. I stood there, the cat blinking at me accusingly, stunned by how quickly she'd gone from calm to furious as if I'd flipped a switch. After a moment of hesitation, I followed her into the sitting room, the Thomas room, I reminded myself, where she stood by the bookcase, her chest visibly rising and falling, a thunderous expression on her face. Julia, I promise, I didn't know until yesterday. A taxi driver mentioned it when I said I was staying here. She stood with her back to me, staring through the window at the cloud-choked sky. And then what did you do? Google me? My silence was confirmation. She turned. Do you know how many journalists I had coming here, day after day, week after week, all of them pretending to be concerned, wanting me to give my side of the story? It took months to get rid of them. And now I've got an author staying here who specialises in writing about missing children. I don't specialise in it. I should never have opened this place. I'm not ready. She covered her reddening face with her hands. She was silent, and I didn't know what to do or say. Eventually I managed, I swear, Julia, that my new book has nothing to do with missing children. I have no interest in writing about you or your family. I feel terribly sorry for you, that's all. She shook her head, as if the sight of me made her sick. If you want me to go, I will. I think that will be best. Okay. I felt sick, but what else could I do? Now? She wouldn't meet my eye. You can stay tonight, but first thing tomorrow, I want you to go. Chapter 6. I dreamt I was drowning, being dragged to the bottom of a river by clutching hands. All I could see beneath me was hair, swaying like fronds, and I swallowed mouthfuls of dirty black water. I could hear music, muffled and soft, a girl singing on the riverbed, sweet but distorted, the melody bent out of shape. I woke up, gasping, but the singing continued. I lay there, still half in the dream, listening, thinking I must still be asleep. Stupidly, I pinched myself. I was definitely awake. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall that separated my room from the one Julia had stopped me going into. Lily's room. That's where the singing was coming from, just as before. Now, in the silence of the night, it was clearer. But I couldn't make out the words. I strained to hear, and then it struck me. The words weren't in English. I hadn't studied Welsh since I was 5 years old, but I was sure I recognised the first few words. Un, dau, tri. 1, 2, 3. The rest of the words, though, and the tune weren't familiar. What was a girl doing in Lily's old room singing in the middle of the night? I was about to leave my room to investigate further when I realised it must be Julia. Yes, it sounded like a child singing, but it was conceivable that it was a woman. Or it could even be someone playing a recording. That must be it. Perhaps Julia was in there now, listening to a recording of her daughter singing. It was unusual behaviour, but people deal with grief in many different ways. The singing stopped. I waited for the sound of Julia leaving the room, but all was silent. Eventually, I got back into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. I'd come up with a solid, rational explanation for what I'd heard, but I was still spooked. And I lay there for hours, the melody from the song repeating inside my head, burrowing deeper into my brain with every loop, until eventually I entered a hypnagogic state where I could hardly tell the difference between imagination and reality. I pictured myself getting out of bed again, crossing the room and touching the wall. It was warm, pulsing, and I became convinced the wall was made of flesh and bone, that the house was alive. I dug my fingernails into the wallpaper and tore holes in the pattern. As the melody from the little girl's song went round and round in my head, blood trickled from beneath my fingers and ran down the walls. The house shuddered, as if it were crying. It didn't take long to gather my stuff and pack my suitcase. Although I felt guilty about looking into what had happened to Julia's daughter and invading her privacy, I also thought I was blameless to some extent. It was surely a coincidence that I'd written about the topic that most hurt Julia. I yawned, exhausted from my disturbed night, haunted by my waking dream. As I checked to see if I'd forgotten anything, I couldn't help but glance over at the walls, expecting to see them bleed. Maybe it was a blessing that I was leaving. One thing had struck me in the morning light. When the house cried in my dream, it had sounded like Priya. I opened my bedroom door just as Karen came down the stairs from her room on the top floor. She spotted my suitcase. "What's going on?" "I'm leaving." "What? Why?" Sensing that she would bombard me with difficult questions if I wasn't honest, I gestured for her to come into my room and take a seat. I told her everything, keeping my voice low. "Oh, that poor woman," she said. "I had no idea." "Do you remember seeing it on the news at the time?" "No, I was living in Italy then." "It's dreadful. I don't have children, but I can imagine." She trailed off. "It's not right for her to chuck you out, though. I mean, you didn't come here because she had a missing child, did you?" "Of course not." She got up. "Let me have a word with her. Maybe I can persuade her that you're a good egg, not a creepy voyeur with a dead child obsession." Before I could protest, she left the room. I sat there, feeling like a schoolboy whose mum has gone to talk to the head teacher to plead his case. 5 minutes later, Julia appeared in my doorway. Can we have a chat?" she said. "Of course, come in." She closed the door behind her. Her hair was tied back in a ponytail, and, fresh-faced and makeup-free in her baggy jumper and leggings, she looked younger than her age. But she had dark smudges beneath her eyes, and her skin was so pale it was almost translucent. She was so thin, too, as if grief had melted the meat from her bones. "Listen, Julia, I promise you I had no idea about Lily before I came here. It's a total coincidence that I wrote a book about missing kids. I would never, ever dream of exploiting. She cut off my babble. Lucas. Sorry. No, I'm sorry. I overreacted. You can stay. Assuming you still want to. I do. Good. That's settled then. Let's forget it ever happened. She went to leave, but I stopped her by saying, Do you want to talk about it? About Lily and Michael? She focused on a spot on the carpet. Not really. I understand. It hurts to talk about it. She looked at me curiously, and I added, I lost someone too. Someone I loved, and it still causes me pain just to think about it, let alone talk about it. For you to lose 2 members of your family. She shook her head. 1. Only Michael. I mean, yes, Lily is lost, but she's not dead. I'm sure of it. Oh. She made an exasperated gesture. Everyone assumes she's dead. The police, all the people in town, my friends, everyone. But they don't. She sat down on the bed. Okay, I'll tell you, but you have to promise you won't put it in a book. On my mother's life. Okay. She turned her face towards the window. It was New Year's Day, 2 years ago. The path along the riverbank was slick with mud. It sucked at the soles of Julia's wellies. The wind caught her from behind, and she almost lost her footing, heart flipping, arms windmilling, until Michael grabbed her arm. Careful! I'm fine. She wriggled free of his grip and pulled her coat tightly around herself, shivering. She called out to Lily, Stay where I can see you! Their daughter was a little way ahead, 8 years old and skinny as a snake, the coat she'd got for Christmas unzipped and hanging from her bony shoulders. She'd refused to put on her hat or gloves, insisting she didn't need them. And it was true. Lily was like a human radiator, always had been. On bitter winter nights when drafts invaded their house, the house that Michael liked to say had its own weather system, Julia would steal into Lily's bed and bask in her glow. Lily was clutching her favourite toy, Big Cat, which she'd had since she was a baby. She raised an arm and carried on along the bank at her own pace. She was at the point where the path descended towards a copse of trees that hugged the bend in the river. She glanced back occasionally, an unreadable expression on her face. Lily had been studying her parents closely today, watching them as if trying to see inside their heads. Most likely she was watching them because she didn't trust the peace between them. Julia opened her mouth to call out again, to tell Lily to stay where she could see her, but Michael said, Leave her. She's happy. I know, I just don't like her going into the trees on her own. Stop fretting, she'll be fine. He put his arms around her and pulled her into a kiss. He still smelled of last night's alcohol, and the kiss was brief, but after a dry spell that had threatened to turn into a drought, it was still something. Julia made her way down the final stretch of the slippery path, glancing at the river as she went. All that recent rainfall had made the water level rise, and it was fast-flowing here, churning white as it swept around the bend. This was a popular spot for whitewater rafting, groups of tourists heading downstream from Bedmaur. Julia shivered again and decided her New Year's resolution on the spot. She would conquer her long-held fear and learn to swim. Lily was still ahead of them, approaching the copse at the bottom of the slope. Julia turned to speak to Michael and saw him sneak something into his pocket. What was that? Nothing. She stepped closer. Show me. Come on, Julia, it was nothing. He went to move past her, but she stepped into his path, making him slip. As he snatched at her arm, she stuck her hand into the pocket of his fleece. He tried to stop her, but she was too fast. She held up the hip flask. The evidence. The broken promise. It's for the cold, he began, before trailing off. She expected him to be apologetic, sheepish, but his eyes flashed with defiance. In that moment he looked just like Lily when Julia told her to tidy her room or do her homework. I don't have a husband and child, she thought. I have 2 children. She flung the hip flask with all her strength towards the river. It fell short, landing on the edge of the bank. They both stared after it. If you pick that up, that's it, she said. I'm not going to. But she saw the way his eyes flicked sideways, could see the longing there. I'm going to catch up with Lily, she said. We can talk about it when we get home. The final part of the path was steep, forcing her to run to avoid slipping again, and she skidded to a halt among the trees. Bare branches, slimy leaf mulch on the ground, more puddles of mud. But no sign of Lily. She strode ahead towards the far edge of the copse, aware of her heartbeat accelerating while following a trail of footsteps. Michael was a few steps behind her as Julia called out, "Lily!" There was no response. Logic told her she would find Lily just beyond the trees, but logic couldn't quell the cold eddy of fear in her belly. "Lily!" she called again, trying to keep her voice light. "We're going to have hot chocolate when we get home. And you can watch as much YouTube as you like," she added silently. Julia emerged on the other side of the copse. Sure, the sky had grown darker during the few minutes she'd been beneath the trees, the clouds more swollen with rain. Ahead, the path rose, steep but not as muddy as before, and the churning in Julia's stomach intensified. Where was she? Where the hell was Lily? Julia ran up the slope to a crest that overlooked the river. The water foamed and snapped at the bank. And that was when she saw it. The sight that almost stopped her heart. Big Cat, floating on the water. "Michael!" His name emerged as a scream. She ran back to him, grabbed hold of his arm and pointed at the river, at the black and white stuffed toy. He saw it immediately, and their eyes locked, mother and father, before he tore off his coat and ran down the bank, across a ledge of flat grey rocks that stretched out to the water. He paused for a second, shouting for their daughter as the river dragged Big Cat beneath its surface. Michael plunged into the water. Julia had no idea how deep it was, but her husband was swallowed up as if he'd never existed. It must have been only seconds later that his head reappeared, but it felt like forever. Julia paced the bank, wringing her hands and trying to focus on the water, searching among the grey and white for a glimpse of Lily. If she thought throwing herself in would save her daughter, would even give her a tiny chance of survival, she would do it without hesitation. But she was helpless. Useless. "I can't see her," Michael called, the panic in his voice reflecting the sick sensation in Julia's stomach. The water rushed around him, crashing over him like waves hitting rocks. "Keep trying!" He went under again, then came back to the surface almost immediately, gasping and fighting to stay afloat. The frigid water squeezed the breath from his lungs, and his voice was weak as he called out for Lily. He caught Julia's eye, and she knew what he was thinking. He was going to give up. She had to do something. "Over there!" she yelled, pointing to the centre of the river. I saw something." He struck out towards where she had pointed, against the current. Water pummeled him and he went under, gulping down air before he kicked out, turning in the water. He was 4 or 5 metres from the bank, clearly struggling, fighting the river as it tried to claim him. In her panicked state, Julia imagined creatures beneath the surface, clutching at Michael's ankles, dragging him down. She pictured Lily down there too, wrapped in a river creature's deathly embrace. Michael was getting weaker. Julia could see it on his face, in his sluggish kick, and a burst of foaming water caught him, sweeping him away from where Julia stood. It didn't cross her mind that he might drown. As a non-swimmer, she had an inflated idea of his abilities. All she wanted was for him to keep trying to find Lily. As he headed for the far bank, submerging for a moment before coming back to the surface, she remembered her phone in her pocket and woke it up with shaking hands, punching 999, yelling at the operator who answered, their calm voice doing nothing to soothe her. When she looked up, Michael was gone. Julia dashed down to the edge of the bank, onto the rocks, expecting Michael to emerge, trying not to panic. She swept her gaze along the river, left, then right. Where was he? Where was he? It was cold, so cold on the riverbank, but she barely felt it, in the same way she couldn't feel the tears on her cheeks. She couldn't feel a thing. There was a silence in the room after she'd finished, the weight of her words thickening the air between us. I groped for something to say, something more than a platitude. Should I tell her my own story now? Show her that I understood exactly how it felt to have someone you love ripped from your world, for a great boot to stamp on your life? Julia spoke before I could make up my mind. I shouldn't have threatened to chuck you out, she said, but you have to understand it's still raw, all of it. There was a long pause. I wondered if she knew I might have heard her during the night. I guessed she hadn't thought about it. It seemed she was compelled to spend her nights in Lily's room, communing with her missing daughter, in the same way an alcoholic is drawn to the bottle. As Julia spoke, she twisted her hands together, ignoring a lock of hair that dropped across her eye. People think that time heals, that you get over it. But every day for me is like a Groundhog Day, you know? I wake up, missing Lily. 100 times a day I imagine her coming through the front door. 100 times a day I blame myself for not keeping a better eye on her. I curse my parents for not forcing me to go to swimming lessons. The same things every single day. And at the end of it, I go to bed, missing Lily. I didn't know what to say. She finally brushed the hair away from her eye. Of course, there are moments when I almost forget. But then I get this feeling of panic, this knowledge that there's something I'm supposed to be worrying about. Then I remember, and the guilt hits me. Like, how could I forget, even for a second? Oh, Julia. I wanted to touch her arm, put a hand on her shoulder, do something to show empathy, an attempt at comfort. But I sat there, a useless bloke not knowing what to do or say. You probably think I should let it go, she said, shattering the silence. My daughter, drowned, move on, she's not going to come back. I don't... Julia got up and went to the window. It was grim outside again. White mist hung over the distant trees, turning them into ghostly silhouettes. Julia stared into the mist as if she expected, or hoped, to see Lily emerge from it, her little girl back from the dead. What did the police say? I asked. They must have searched for her. According to Ollie, the cab driver, and the news reports, the river had been swarming with police. But Julia's face told a different story. They gave up, almost immediately, she said. The investigation is supposedly still open, but I haven't heard anything for over a year. Nobody's actively working on it. They gave up within weeks because they were convinced she drowned. But you are convinced she didn't. Her gaze was intense. They would have found her body. I'm sure of it. Not necessarily. She shook her head. I can't believe that she would have been swept along the river that quickly when Big Cat was still there. What do you think happened? She didn't hesitate. Somebody took her. He was waiting, beyond the trees. Maybe he'd spotted us walking along the path. It could have been opportunistic. Or maybe he followed us there, hoping for a chance to take Lily. A chance we gave him by lagging behind, by not watching her properly. In her head, she was back by the river, perhaps imagining a sliding doors moment, a different path. I think someone was following us, she said. I studied her. What makes you say that? Just, it seems beyond even my bad luck that a predator just happened to be out there that day, that he made a decision and acted so quickly. And it's not just that. In the days leading up to Lily's disappearance, I had this feeling that we were being watched. What do you mean? Just, have you ever had that sensation? That there are eyes on you, but when you turn round there's nobody there? I nodded. I knew that sensation well. I still feel like that now, she said. All the time. I think I can see Lily in my peripheral vision, just standing there watching me. But when I turn, no matter how quickly I move, trying to catch her out, she's never there. I understood. I'd had the same sensation with Priya. What else did the police do? I asked. Apart from dragging the river, I mean. I don't know exactly. They looked in the surrounding woods, but didn't find anything. They spoke to a few local men on the sex offenders register, put out appeals for witnesses, checked road cameras, but it always felt to me like they were ticking boxes. They thought it was all a waste of time. She had to be in the river. Have you ever considered hiring a private investigator? I wanted to, but... She sighed. I I'm skint. A couple of people started an appeal for funds to help find Lily, but it didn't raise much. The public believed what the police said, that she'd drowned. And another child, a 4-year-old girl, vanished at the same time down in London. Do you remember? Violet something. Her dad was a politician. The press gave all their attention to her. They soon forgot all about Lily. But I'm convinced, Lucas, she's still out there, and I won't give up hope. I can't. It's the only thing that keeps me going. She sighed. I've taken up too much of your time, and I need to make breakfast. The others will be wondering what's going on. She stood and left the room without looking back. I crossed to the window. The mist was clearing slowly, bringing the world into focus. In the distance, the river wound dull and flat across the landscape. Was Julia right? Could Lily still be out there somewhere? Chapter 7. Lily. 2014. Chesney! Chesney! Where was that stupid cat? Lily stood by the back door, calling and calling, until she wasn't sure what was her original voice and what was an echo. She was fascinated by echoes. When she was a little kid, like 2 years ago, Dad made her go trekking up Snowdon. It was boring, except for the cafe at the top, where she had an enormous hot chocolate with cream and sprinkles, and, even better, the bit where they stood at the top of the mountain and yelled, "Hello!" listening to it bounce around and back again. But Chesney, that stupid, lovely fluff monster, wasn't responding to her voice or its echo. Lily glanced behind her. Mum was working on her computer and Dad was in his study. She wasn't supposed to go out on her own, even though she wasn't a baby anymore, but she really wanted to find Chesney. She slipped on her trainers and headed over to the cottage. It was locked, and she didn't think the cat could have got in there. She hunted around the garden, making little kissing noises and calling his name. She was getting worried now. What if he'd been run over? Megan said her cat got flattened by a car after falling asleep in the middle of the road. That was the problem with quiet places where there's hardly any traffic. Cats think they can lie down and sleep anywhere. Lily didn't think Chesney was that dumb, though. He was a very special cat. Probably the best, cleverest cat in the world. And she loved him. Every night he slept on the end of the bed, and she didn't mind him lying across her feet so she couldn't move. It didn't bother her that her sheets were covered in fur and this speckly black stuff that Mum said was disgusting flea dirt. Sometimes she thought he was her best friend. She liked Megan, but Chesney was the only one she could talk to when Mum and Dad were fighting. Which was pretty much every day at the moment. She heard them at night when they thought she was sleeping, when she was actually under the covers with her iPad watching her favourite YouTubers. Her mum did most of the shouting, while Dad's voice was a low rumble she couldn't make out. Mum was always going on about drinking and being on her own. Another woman's name came up a lot too, a woman who Dad worked with. Lily had asked him who Lana was once, and he went white before saying it was just a woman in his office. Megan said her mum and Dad had argued a lot too. Then they got divorced when Megan was little. Her dad lived on his own in another town, and Megan hardly ever saw him. Now, the only man in Megan's life was her granddad. When Lily thought about her own parents divorcing, she went colder than ice and had to squeeze Chesney really hard to stop herself from crying. She had reached the edge of the garden, and there was still no sign of Chesney. Beyond the fence was a stretch of overgrown grass and long flowers that were probably weeds, dandelion clocks and stinging nettles. Dad said there were rabbit warrens in the field, though Lily had never seen any. Maybe that's where Chesney was now, lying unseen in the long grass waiting for a bunny to come hopping out of its hole. Lily didn't believe her cat would kill a rabbit. He never brought any gross dead stuff into the house, probably because he knew Mum would freak out, but he probably liked watching them. Checking no grown-ups were watching, Lily climbed over the low fence into the little meadow. She hadn't realised how foggy it was until she moved away from the house. The mist hung among the trees like a giant cloud, white and spooky-looking. She imagined it was cold to the touch. There was no way Lily would go into those woods on her own, especially when it was foggy like that. She didn't want the widow to get her. Not that she believed. "Lily!" She almost jumped out of her skin. "Lily! Where are you?" Her mum was starting to sound panicked now, and Lily felt the urge to stay hidden. If Mum got really worried, then she'd be incredibly relieved when Lily turned up, and she might give her a treat. Maybe she'd feel guilty about working, and Lily would be able to persuade her to buy those Heelys she needed. She crouched in the grass, trying to decide what to do. Her mum's voice grew fainter as she moved away. Lily stood up. She felt mean, but was also worried that Mum might be angry with her. She walked back towards the fence and saw a movement out of the corner of her eye. Chesney? She whirled around. A shape vanished into the trees and was swallowed by the fog. It was too big to be Chesney. Too big and person-shaped. Lily bolted, scrambling over the fence and catching her finger on a jagged piece of wood. It dug into her flesh, a splinter that brought forth a drop of blood. Ow! It really hurt, and now she had tears in her eyes. Through the wet blur, she took another look back towards the woods. There was nothing there. Had she imagined it? The widow, opening her gigantic black mouth to call Lily's name. She didn't wait around to find out. She sprinted across the garden, calling, "Mom! Mommy!" She forgot all about the cat. Chapter 8. Julia might not have been able to afford to hire a private investigator, but I could. I had recently received another large royalty payment for Sweetmeat and had very little to spend it on. What would she think? Would she think I was interfering, going too far? She had already almost thrown me out, and it would be foolish to risk that happening again. But it wouldn't hurt to make inquiries, would it? If I got anywhere, I would tell Julia. That's what I told myself, anyway. When I was researching Sweetmeat, I befriended a private detective called Edward Rooney. He'd been briefly famous because of his involvement in a weird case involving Romanian criminals and babies, which was why I'd contacted him. I wanted to know how he would go about tracking a missing person. He was a nice guy, haunted by the things he'd seen, but willing to help, for a fee. Worried that Julia might overhear me, I took my mobile to the edge of the garden. Edward's assistant Sophie answered and transferred me across. "Lucas!" he exclaimed. "Or should I say, acclaimed novelist, L.J. Radcliffe." I don't know about acclaimed. Ha! Don't be modest, man. I read it. Bloody brilliant. So, what can I do for you? I explained that I was helping out a friend and was hoping to get some advice. Then I detailed everything I knew about Lily's disappearance and the subsequent investigation. The police have given up, apparently, convinced Lily drowned, but Julia doesn't believe they did everything they could to find her, that they gave up too easily. She can't afford to hire someone, so I offered to help out. I cleared my throat. It was a white lie. It was quiet on Edward's end of the line. Eventually he said, "You should save your money." "Why'd you say that?" "Because in cases like this, when it involves kids, the police always pull out all the stops, especially if the parents are nice and middle class. I don't think an investigator would be able to find out any more than the police did, and it's just going to stir up all the hope in your friend's heart again." I thought about it. But if we can set Julia's mind at rest, so she knows the police explored every avenue... He sighed. "All right. You're not going to let this go, are you?" "I don't want to." "OK, look, I'm busy at the moment. There's no way I can schlep all the way to Wales. But I do know someone who lives in Telford, just across the border. Let me text you her number." "OK," I said. I have to admit I was disappointed. Edward's text arrived a minute later. I looked up at Nithe Bran and shivered as I remembered my half-dream, the bleeding walls, the sense that the house was alive. I ought to be in there, writing. The problem was, I had an itch now. I wanted to know what had happened to Lily, and not just because I couldn't resist a mystery. I imagined myself finding her, bringing her to Julia, the tears and the joy that would follow. Even if the chance of this happening was 1,000 to 1, the image was powerful enough to compel me to do something. I called the number Edward had sent me. Zara Sullivan wasn't busy. In fact, she told me she could meet me in Bedmar in 2 hours. While we were on the phone, she looked up cafes in the town on TripAdvisor and told me she'd be at Rhiannon's cafe at 1 o'clock. "I'll be wearing a red baseball cap," she said, then hung up. I stared at my phone. Was she for real? Or was Edward playing a joke on me? I arrived at the cafe 5 minutes late. It was the kind of place I'd usually avoid, chintzy and dimly lit, all pots of tea and scones, frequented and staffed almost exclusively by the over-60s. There were a number of paintings on the walls depicting mining scenes, men heading down the pit, women with babes in arms watching them go. Among these, the same picture that hung in the pub, the woman in red among the trees. Sitting in the corner with a pot of tea before her was a woman in a red baseball cap. She took it off as I approached and shook out her hair, which was blonde and stringy, hanging around a moon-shaped face. It was hard to tell how old she was, somewhere between 30 and 40, though she was dressed like a teenager in a black puffer jacket. She really didn't look like a private detective, but then everyone said I, with my reddish hair and friendly face, didn't look like a horror novelist. "I'll listen to your book on the drive here," she said. "First hour of it, anyway. Not bad." Thanks. "I'm sure the more you write, the better you'll get." She raised a hand and beckoned over the waitress, a sprightly woman in her 70s. I ordered coffee. "Let's discuss terms," Zara said, not wasting any time. Her hourly rate was more than I'd expected, but still reasonable. "I could travel in from Telford every day, but it would be easier for me to stay here," she said, "if you're willing to pay. I like to immerse myself, get to know the locals." That's fine. "Luckily, I have an FWB in the police in Wrexham." That was the nearest large town where the investigation into Lily's disappearance would have been centred. FWB? Uh-huh. A friend with benefits? More than one benefit in this case. She grinned and slurped her tea. "Have a Welsh cake. They're scrummy." Producing a notebook from her messenger bag, she said, "Right. Can you tell me everything you know?" Before I start, there's one condition. I don't want Julia Marsh finding out I've hired you to do this. I'll tell her if you find anything, but I don't want to get her hopes up, so you need to be discreet." "Discretion is my middle name." She readied her pencil over her pad and raised her eyebrows. The cafe was busy, but the hubbub masked our words, as I told her what I knew. She wrote it all down, then closed her notepad. "OK, I'll call you tomorrow with a progress report." She stuck out her hand. It was sticky with cake residue. "Let's find out what happened to little Lily." I spent the afternoon working on my novel. It was about a father who believes the world is coming to an end. He takes his family, his wife and daughter, to live in a shack in the middle of a forest away from danger. The twist is that the world really is ending. A plague is sweeping across the planet, turning people into hungry monsters. I avoided using the word zombies. And these monsters begin to close in on the family in the woods. After dinner, I went into the Thomas room to find something to read. Julia had an impressive collection of books, mostly classics and contemporary literature, with the occasional thriller dotted around the shelves. I could see a line of brightly coloured spines on the top shelf. Intrigued, I climbed the library ladder and saw that most of these books bore the Jackdaw logo. That was the publisher Julia had done most of her work for. Standing on the middle rung, I took down a book called 12 Little Beasties. It was indeed illustrated by Julia Marsh, a parade of comical monsters in bright colours. I was impressed. Julia was talented. If she'd stopped work, that only compounded the tragedy of what had happened to her. At the end of the shelf, a book with a tatty spine stuck out at an angle. Feeling compelled to straighten it, I pulled it out and found an illustrated edition of Edward Lear's poem The Owl and the Pussycat. The book looked old, and I wondered if it had belonged to Julia when she was a child. I turned to the first page to see if there was an inscription, but the title page had been torn out. I flicked through the book, and something fell to the ground beneath me. I descended the ladder and picked it up. It was a faded Polaroid of a couple. A tall, skinny man in his 40s standing stiffly beside a shorter woman. Despite their late 70s, early 80s haircuts and clothes, they reminded me of the couple in that painting American Gothic. I studied the photo, trying to work out where it had been taken, but the background was too dark, the colours muted and blurred. "What have you got there?" It was Max, coming into the room with Susie. They appeared to have made up. I slipped the Polaroid back into the book and stuck it between two books on the nearest shelf. "Nothing." Max eyed the bookcase. "I'm sure if we pushed this in the right place, it would rotate to reveal a secret passageway," he said. "It's that kind of house." Something from the famous Five, added Susie. No, creepier than that, said Max. Like something from one of Lucas's books. They sat on the sofa, and I perched on the armchair opposite. Someone told me this house is cursed. I explained what the taxi driver had said. Max's eyes shone. How exciting. I love stories like that. Modern folklore. A friend of mine comes from Hastings, where Aleister Crowley lived. Apparently, he cursed the town, so it's impossible to leave unless you take a pebble from the beach with you. Nonsense, obviously, but fun. Where's Karen? I asked. I think she went up for a smoke. Maybe we should join her, Susie said. Good idea. What do you think, Lucas? Shall we go and see if Karen's willing to share her stash? He was so naff, but I nodded. Why not? Upstairs, Max knocked lightly on Karen's door. I was a little embarrassed. We were acting like a group of naughty schoolchildren sneaking around the dorm. I wasn't expecting to hear a gasp of fear from inside the room. "Leave me alone!" Karen cried. Max and I exchanged a worried glance. "Karen," I said through the door, "it's Lucas. Are you okay?" I heard footsteps, then the key turning in the lock. Karen pulled open the door and stuck her head out, looking left and right. "Come in," she hissed. We trooped into the room. Karen had retreated to the edge of her bed, clenching her fists. The window was open, but the room stank of cannabis. Karen's pupils were huge, dilated like black pools. "Shut the door," she said. "Lock it." Susie sat beside her. "What's the matter?" "Somebody was trying to get into my room." Automatically, I looked at Max. "Hey, wasn't me," he said. "No," said Susie. "He's been with me the whole time." "Karen," Max said, "are you sure you didn't imagine it? What exactly are you smoking?" There was a little bag on the bedside table. Max picked it up and held it to the light, as if he'd be able to tell how strong it was. Karen continued to stare into space. "They whispered something through the door." "Really? What did they say?" "You're not welcome here." We all looked at each other. "Male or female?" I asked, thinking about the singing I'd heard. But Karen appeared to have gone into a stupor, staring in terror at the door. Her face was as pale as the moon that shone through the window. "I'm going to be sick." She rushed from the room, and we heard her running down the hall towards the bathroom. "She's stoned, that's all," Max said. "Pulling a what do you call it? A whiteout?" "A whitey," I said. But Susie had gone almost as pale as Karen. "I wasn't high when someone tried to get into my room." "I told you," said Max. "It wasn't me." He seemed concerned for a moment, then laughed. "It's the curse. The ghost of the dead miner. Woo!" "Oh, shut up, Max." But Susie laughed too. "Are you sure it's not you doing it?" Max said, and I was so deep in thought that it took a moment to realize he was talking to me. "Maybe you're conducting research for your next book. Some kind of meta-experiment." "I was downstairs with you, remember?" Well, anyway, it's all quite exciting, isn't it?" We left Karen's room. Max headed back downstairs, and Susie said she would wait to check that Karen was okay. I went to my room. The most likely explanation was that Karen was stoned and imagining things, almost certainly triggered by what had happened to Susie. And Max was lying. He had tried to get into Susie's room but wouldn't admit it. It was all perfectly rational. So why did I lie in bed, unable to sleep again, imagining a figure on the other side of my door trying to get in? "You're not welcome here." I finally went to sleep with those words echoing in my head. Chapter 9. The atmosphere at breakfast was subdued. Karen seemed embarrassed by the incident the previous night and still looked a little green around the gills. Max tapped at his phone throughout, apparently conducting a Twitter spat with someone who'd made an ill-judged joke about depression. Susie hadn't come down. I guess she was still asleep or working in her room. I took my used breakfast things into the kitchen where Julia was stacking the dishwasher, the cat snaking around her ankles. It was another cold day, frost sparkling on the lawn. Rodri was in the garden, fixing a section of fencing that had blown down in the strong winds the previous week. "Did he come with the house?" I asked, nodding towards Rodri. Huh? Oh, you mean, did he work here before we moved in? Apparently so. He introduced himself to Michael as soon as we got here, but Michael told him we wouldn't need his help because he was determined to do all that stuff himself. That was part of the appeal of coming here. She closed the dishwasher. He had so many plans for this place. Her eyes shone with emotion. Rodri must have sensed us watching him, as he raised a hand before turning back to the fence. What was the previous owner like? I asked, thinking of the Polaroid I'd found the night before. I have no idea. An old woman lived here. When she died, she left the house to a children's charity. We bought it from them at auction. On my way up to my room, my mobile rang. It was Zara. I met up with my friend last night. I assumed she meant the one with benefits. I hoped she wasn't going to add condoms to her expenses. He told me a few interesting things. Very interesting things indeed. I agreed to meet Zara by the river, at the spot where Lily had gone missing. I found her sitting on a fallen tree trunk smoking a cigarette and gazing out at the water. Mist hung low among the shrubbery on the opposite bank. My policeman friend remembers the case very well, Zara said, stubbing out her cigarette and slipping the butt into a little plastic bag. He repeated what you already told me, that they were initially convinced she fell into the river. They spent a lot of money searching. They had helicopters out, frogmen, the whole works. You name it, all without success. I knew all that, I said. But what do you know about bodies in water? You wrote a book about it, didn't you? I'm assuming you did lots of research. I avoided her eyes. A bit. Ha! Well, my friend explained it to me. When someone drowns, the air in their lungs is replaced with water, which makes them sink. They stay underwater for a while, and, assuming nothing eats them, the bacteria and enzymes in their chest and gut start to produce gas. Methane, carbon dioxide, and some other gas that I can't remember the name of. And the gas makes them float to the surface. Exactly. She produced a Mars bar from her coat pocket and unwrapped it. Want a bit? This conversation isn't giving me much of an appetite. She snorted and sang a jingle from our childhood. A Mars a day makes your teeth rot away. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Lily Marsh didn't float. The police were convinced she would pop to the surface of the lake, but they waited and they waited, and still no sign of little Lily. I stared at her. Now, there's nothing in that lake that could have eaten her up. No monsters living in the woods round here, Mr. Radcliffe, so if she did go in the water, she must have been weighed down, which didn't fit with her supposed accidental drowning, or she got caught on something under the water. Supposed accidental drowning? Yes. If she was weighed down, it must have been murder, but that didn't fit either, because her body would almost certainly be on the riverbed, not in the lake. A pair of moorhens drifted by. When Lily's body didn't appear, the police turned their attention to the mother. I was shocked. To Julia? Huh? Think about it. There were no witnesses other than Mrs. Marsh. They only had her word for what happened. My friend said her distress seemed genuine, but maybe it was an accident, one that she tried to cover up. What kind of accident? The world around us was eerily quiet and still. A songbird called out from a tree above our heads. The water made a rushing sound as it rounded the bend. Apart from that, all was silent. Zara crumpled her chocolate wrapper and stuck it in the pocket of her puffer jacket. Julia admitted to the police that all was not well in the Marsh household. She had to, because they'd had a massive row in the supermarket just before Christmas, in the alcohol aisle. The police found a witness who reported seeing Julia yelling at Michael about the amount of booze he'd put in the trolley. Something about broken promises, about Christmas being ruined. Lily was there, watching. I thought about Julia's alcohol ban at the retreat. Had Michael Marsh been an alcoholic? When they did the autopsy, the pathologist found high levels of alcohol in Mr. Marsh's blood, so he'd been drinking that day. Here's a theory. What if Julia and Michael had another huge row when they were down by the river and she pushed him in? I thought about it. Well, that's possible, I suppose, but what about Lily? The police thought maybe Julia chucked Lily in too, because she was the only witness. That's ludicrous. Or maybe she planned to kill them all, including herself. Murder-suicide. but she chickened out when it was her turn. Or, how about this? Julia pushed her hubby into the water and their daughter jumped in to try to save him. Julia can't swim, so she couldn't do anything to help. The bird in the tree had stopped singing. But that still doesn't answer the question, what happened to Lily's body? Zara shrugged. That's where the police got stuck too. They had cadaver dogs out searching the woods looking for a grave, thinking that if Lily didn't drown, maybe Julia killed her and buried her somewhere. They searched the house too. So Julia knew she was a suspect. I guess they used the old exploring every avenue line. But they didn't find anything, and Julia never slipped up. So they went back to square one. The most likely explanation was that it all happened exactly as Julia described, and Lily's body is stuck somewhere at the bottom of Barla Lake. I mulled over what Zara had told me. Could Julia be responsible? No. I was sure her distress was genuine, and it wasn't guilt. Unless she was the world's greatest actress, a psychopath, she genuinely didn't know what had happened to her daughter. So, basically, I said, you haven't really made any progress. Except, I've done what you asked. Checked the police took it seriously, that they did indeed pull out all the stops. Maybe Lucas is one of those mysteries that will never be solved, like the Marie Celeste, or those UFO nuts who may or may not have jumped off Beachy Head a few years ago. I blinked at her. So, what do you want me to do? She asked. I stood up and paced around the copse, hoping the movement of my feet would trigger my brain. Did the police interview local sex offenders? Paedophiles? Yep, it's a small community. There weren't that many guys for them to talk to, but they got them all in, checked their alibis, searched the houses. Nada. Well, maybe they didn't search hard enough, especially if they were fixated on this theory that Julia was responsible, or it was an accident. Again, she shrugged. That's possible. You want me to do some digging? I do. She pushed herself to her feet. All right then. Digging I shall do. We headed up towards the road where Zara's car was parked. The mist had cleared and the sun had come out, bathing the landscape in buttery early spring light. Zara paused to take it in, then looked at me. So, you come from round here originally, she said. I'm curious. You hardly know this Julia woman, do you? Why are you trying to help her? I was taken aback by her directness. I feel bad for her. I want to help. You sure that's all it is? We reached Zara's car, a 10-year-old Honda. Inside it was littered with fast food containers and sweet wrappers. I'm not sure what you mean, I said. Oh, nothing, it's just... She laughed. Sorry, I know I can be overly frank sometimes, but I've seen photos of Julia Marsh. She's a good-looking woman. And you think I'm helping her as a way of getting her into bed? She unlocked her car. Hey, I don't mean to offend you, but there's a certain kind of man who can't resist a damsel in distress. And by certain kind of man, I mean one with blood in his veins and a dick between his legs. She chuckled as she got into the car. She wound down the window. I'll see what I can find out about the local kiddie fiddlers and call you tomorrow. She drove off, leaving me squinting into the sun and wondering, was she right? Did I have an ulterior motive? Zara was correct about one thing. Julia was attractive, but it was despite the mask of pain she wore, not because of it. And I didn't fancy her. I felt uncomfortable, though, as I walked back to the house, and I made up my mind. I would give Zara another 24 hours. If she didn't find out anything interesting, and it seemed unlikely that she would, I'd give up, put my head down, and finish my book without any further distractions. Chapter 10. Julia was in the garden talking to Rodri, who was showing her the mended fence panel. He took his tools over to the shed, and Julia waved at me as I walked up the driveway towards her. She was wearing an old-looking top and gardening gloves, hair scraped back, glasses on. She looked lovely. I mentally kicked myself. Yes, she was attractive, but I didn't fancy her. It was Zara's fault for putting the idea in my head. Been for a stroll? She asked. I had the horrible sense she could read my mind. Flustered, I said, yeah, just trying to get the mental cogs turning. Where did you go? I hesitated. It's all right, she said. I can hear the word river without having a meltdown. Rodri came over, nodding at me. Gorgeous day, isn't it? Julia told me you come from round these parts. What are your parents' names? Carol and David Radcliffe. You're joking. David Radcliffe, the solicitor? That's right. You knew him? He seemed slightly stunned. I know everyone around here. It's been a bloody long time, though. What are they up to these days? They retired to Spain, I replied. He whistled. All right for some. Well, give them my regards when you speak to them. He pointed at the flower beds. What are you planning to do here, Julia? Weeding, mainly, and I was thinking of moving those peonies. What? You can't do that. He acted as if she'd said she was going to pour petrol on the earth and set it aflame. Why not? It's bad luck, he replied. If you move peonies, a woodpecker will come and peck out your eyes. Julia laughed, but Rhodri looked deadly serious. Please don't move them, Julia. Okay. He nodded, satisfied, and headed off to the shed. Julia and I exchanged an amused look. Well, I guess the peonies do look all right where they are. I should probably tell him my dad passed away, I said. Oh, I'm sorry. Did it happen recently? I must have cringed because she added, Don't worry, if you'd rather not talk about it. No, it's fine. It's healthy to talk about it, isn't it? It was 5 years ago now. Pancreatic cancer. He died 3 weeks after getting the diagnosis. How awful. I scraped at the ground with the toe of my shoe. Apparently with pancreatic cancer there are no symptoms until it's too late. The good thing is that he didn't suffer for long. How's your mum? Julia asked. She's okay. She lives in Spain, so I don't see her much. She's fine, though. She's one of those women who just gets on with it. Whatever shit life throws at her. She's always been like that. I could tell Julia was thinking about herself, the shit life had thrown at her, and her reaction. I was about to change the subject when Karen emerged from the house carrying a laptop. She saw us and came over. I was just going to the cottage to do some work, she said. We exchanged a few pleasantries about the weather, then she said, I saw the new guest earlier, so now there are 5 of us. Julia looked puzzled. Another guest? Yeah, I got up at 6, and when I came down to make coffee, I saw them in the dining room. We don't have any other guests, Julia said. Just you and Lucas, Max and Susie. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Oh. Were they male or female? I asked. Female, I think. They had their back to me, and I only got a brief glimpse, but I thought it was a woman. You must have imagined it, Julia said. Karen seemed troubled by this. That's really strange. I'm sure I saw someone. Perhaps it was Susie, I offered. No, I'm pretty certain she was still in bed. She chewed a thumbnail. I suppose I must have still been a little... She stopped herself, but Julia laughed. Stoned? I'm not completely wet behind the ears, Karen. I can smell it in your room. I was going to ask you to do it outside. There are certain boring regulations I have to follow. Sorry to be a massive killjoy. No, I'm sorry. Karen cringed. So now I feel like a naughty schoolgirl who's been caught smoking out the window. I'd better get on. She headed over to the cottage. That's all I need, Julia said. People seeing things. You should all lay off the weed. She tugged at her gardening gloves. I'd better get on. I was going to defend Karen, but Julia had already knelt by the flower bed and picked up the little fork. She jabbed it into the dirt, grabbing handfuls of weeds and yanking them from the earth. A strand of hair fell over her face, and she pushed it away with a gloved fist before attacking the flower bed again. She caught me watching her, and I looked away embarrassed. I'd been imagining her taking off those gloves and laying her hands on me, inviting me to lie down on the grass with her. I walked back to the house on shaky legs, face burning. Not because I thought it was wrong, per se, to be attracted to Julia, or to fantasize about her. No, it was because it felt like a betrayal. What are you up to today? Oh, nothing special. I was just going to carry on making notes for this new idea. The sweetmeat one? Sounds good. Priya kissed me goodbye and said something else, but I wasn't really listening. My mind had already strayed to my book, to this idea that wouldn't work, that I was on the verge of abandoning, along with my whole writing career. The ideas, the words wouldn't come, and half an hour after Priya left for work, I put the TV on, pretending to hope it might stimulate my brain. I was watching a phone-in about neighbours from hell when the landline rang. It was Priya's boss at the insurance company. "I just wanted to check that Priya's okay," she said. "You're supposed to call in if you're sick. It's an important rule." "But she left for work," I checked the time, "almost 3 hours ago." I hung up and tried her number. It went straight to voicemail. I texted her, asking her to call me urgently, and tried to phone her again. There was a knot in my stomach that grew bigger with every passing second. She cycled to work every morning, even though I told her it was dangerous, that the roads in London were insane and choked with rage-filled lunatics. She always laughed off my concerns. "It's the most exciting part of my day," she said. Once I would have said, "What, more exciting than coming home to me?" But I knew the answer. I knew that coming home to her morose, waster, has-been boyfriend was probably something she dreaded. She'd been coming home later and later recently, going out for drinks with her colleagues frequently, going to bed early. Our sex life was in a coma. It was all my fault, but I was unable to do anything about it. I was in a pit, wallowing in self-pity, and I wanted to dig myself out, but the shovel was too heavy, my limbs too weak. Everything was too much effort. Now, though, as I continually redialed Priya's number, fear jerked me to life like a defibrillator. I knew the route Priya took to work, through the park and down a maze of back streets before crossing the Thames and hitting the manic main roads of North London. I called the police and the hospital. They told me not to worry. It had only been a few hours. But I knew. Something terrible had happened. I was about to go out to look for her when an idea struck me. Priya's iPhone. I knew her Apple password, so quickly opened the Find My iPhone app and logged in as her. A map appeared on the screen, a blue dot pulsing and telling me that her phone was on a quiet street between Clapham and Battersea. It wasn't moving. I almost caused an accident on the Elephant and Castle roundabout, driving across 2 lanes in my haste to get to that motionless blue dot. Horns sounded. A woman gave me the finger. I checked the map as I rounded Clapham Common, turning off into the leafy residential streets that Priya and I had wandered together numerous times. One day we were going to buy a place around here and raise a family. One day, when I was a best-selling author and we had enough money. I found the place where the blue spot pulsed on the map and pulled over. There was no sign of Priya or her phone.